Spread the fire. Welcome to the State of the Nation. Boy, have we got a guest for you today. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. Sizwe, welcome to the State of the Nation. I'm so glad to have you with us.
Mike, pleasure to be here. And you should do the intros on SMWX from now on.
I tell you, this spread the fire stuff, it's a bit concerning when people are dying in fires.
We
I don't know
actually,
if you've ever considered that.
we had an
Maybe your
episode.
fault.
We had an episode straight after some arson attack, and we were like, "This is figurative. This is definitely figurative."
Sizwe, let's start off with your own story. You
Sure.
must have, there must be a lot of people, and probably many of the people watching us today must have, without question, some preconceived ideas about you and your politics.
There's no doubt about that. When you're on YouTube, people have preconceptions about you, which I'm sure
Yes.
you're very familiar with. But of
Yeah,
course,
try being a middle-aged white guy, you get that,
fair enough.
But
fair
you're
enough.
the son of a fairly famous person who's been very politically active.
Yeah, that's true. My father is none other than Advocate Dali Mpofu.
Yes.
And because he's such a prominent, famous, some say infamous, advocate, because he's represented a series of controversial clients, throughout his very long legal career, people often identify the client with the lawyer, and much to my bafflement, they identify the lawyer with the lawyer's son.
Yes.
And so people assume that I represent the political cause of my father's clients, which can be quite soul-destroying at times because I have a mind of my own. Sometimes I happen to disagree with my father and his clients, and sometimes I vehemently disagree with them. But what I have learned is that if I just keep doing my thing for long enough, more people will appreciate that I'm not doing this to, forward anyone's nefarious agenda. I'm trying to start a public debate. I'm trying to contribute constructively to the South African political landscape. And I think ultimately the truth will out.
Yep. Well, and that's the biggest reason for having you on the show is that I think that if there's one thing that binds us is our hope that we could get a better quality outcome for South Africa.
Sure.
By talking to people, by giving people a more informed view of people, because I suppose in the history of this country, we've never had so much access to information and by definition, access to understanding what you're getting when you support certain people or certain movements.
I think that's absolutely true. The quality of public discourse in South Africa, I think, is lacking. I think there's an absence of debate across different extremes. I think we're extremely polarized as a society, and the condition of our society and the fact that it's worsening at such a rapid and alarming pace only exacerbates that polarization. And I think now more than ever, we need platforms and channels that bridge those divides, that spark important debates, and that have serious and much needed conversations without fueling the fire of unnecessary polarization and without breaking the bonds that should ultimately unite, this political community that we've built called South Africa. And it's a really difficult thing to do. I'm sure you've also realized the easiest thing to do on YouTube would be to just pander to a populist audience and say completely incendiary things that would get, many, many clicks. And the more you do it, the more you realize how that's possible. But ultimately, there is a duty to hold back on that and present audiences with a much more true picture.
Yeah, because the one thing that seems to have disappeared almost globally, South Africa right in the middle of it, has been, if you want to call it debate. I mean, obviously it started with the Thabo Mbeki era where he started to disrespect Parliament by not even pitching up. And then he won't take questions as such. You've got to give the questions beforehand, which is ridiculous. You can't really hold the president to account. He started it, and his successors have just kind of got crazy. And when you see, certainly in this administration, Cyril Ramaphosa, he just never answers a question, does he? I mean, sometimes he'll give a glib, smiley answer, but he'll never really answer the question that's being put to him.
Yeah, I think part of that is the ANC's dominance, and that the ANC up to this point has been able to treat Parliament largely as a rubber stamping body. The ANC NEC is where the power lies, and they get to close the doors, make the decisions. None of us can be in that room, and they are effectively able to dictate to a large extent within constitutional bounds, sometimes not, the direction of the country. And I think that has over time eroded Parliament to the point that we saw it, for example, in the Ngandla matter, where clearly Parliament became a lapdog for the ruling party. President Ramaphosa is interesting because he comes in on this wave of optimism, which I've many times described, and I was one of the few people at the time to describe as misguided. But I think very soon realizes that because of that large majority and because there's virtually no public accountability in the media landscape, that he actually doesn't have to answer any questions. And why would you if you don't need to? And I think the South African media largely gave President Ramaphosa a blank check. And what do politicians do with blank checks? Well, they use them for their own purposes. And I don't blame President Ramaphosa for realizing very early on that he was never going to be criticized, so he could do as he pleased. And I think that's a large reason why we are now in an era of unaccountability that we're trying to rescue ourselves from. We created it in large part in the media and in many corners of society, business as well.
Yeah, I think if you go to his place there at Pala Pala, there's a couch that's full of blank checks. It sits next to the bigger couch.
Your words, not mine.
But yeah, we definitely have a big issue with accountability, and debate. People don't like to get questioned, and there's a thing that I see that's obviously quite. I think we need to get past if the country is going to succeed, and that is the easy tags. The easy sort of tag of giving. Calling the EFF populist or the DA a racist party or this or that. It's not really helping the country, is it?
I agree. Just on that, though, I think we're in this strange situation and have been for the last 5 years or so, where in some ways there's more accountability for opposition politicians than there is for the most powerful politicians in the country, and especially the president. So we've almost got it reversed. John Steenhuisen faces massive public accountability. One slip up, the media's on him, social media's on him, and he's under this barrage of criticism, and rightly so. Julius Malema gets pilloried left, right, and center, castigated. The media, certainly doesn't have a lot of friends in that space. All I think we need to do in South Africa is be equal about it. And furthermore, the more power you wield, because let's be honest, neither John Steenhuisen nor Julius Malema actually runs the country. The more power you wield, the more accountability should be applied on you. So I just wanted to point that out, because I've always found it ironic over the last 5 years how we hold opposition politicians more accountable than the president himself. On the question of easy titles and epithets, I think that's absolutely right. Of course, the DA needs to answer questions about, is it resonating with Black South Africans, or is it tone deaf, as many people call it? Of course, the EFF needs to answer questions. Does it pander to populist instincts? But I think there's a lot more to both parties. I think there's a lot more to all parties, and the beauty is in the nuance. Because when you step away from the easy criticism, you then start to understand South African politics more deeply, and some of the things that are happening around you become more apparent when you take off the either the rose-tinted glasses or you take off the biased lens. So
obviously, the ANC have been. It's very hard to hold them to account. They're great at circling the wagons, protecting whoever is in the firing line. They use the entire machinery to keep accountability. I mean, probably the biggest scandal is that we go through the whole Zondo Commission, which comes out in volumes, and nobody of any consequence has answered anything for it. They're able to get away with murder.
I think that's largely true, particularly when you look at the Chief Justice's recommendations that could have been implemented without any further investigation. So I actually interviewed Zondo, and I asked him, are you disappointed with the way that your recommendations are being implemented? And I was shocked, and I would urge people to go and check it out. He said, yes, I am. I can't believe so little has been done There are certain people who are pointed out who are in cabinet, and he lists them. And you don't need the NPA to investigate whether they should resign or if they can't resign, be fired. And they just haven't been. So, I mean, it's very patently clear that the ANC has not fully implemented the Zondo recommendations in full in time. Now, President Ramaphosa's response seems to be this, that, look, I'm waging a war inside the party and I'm not going to win every single battle, but over time, if I can win enough battles, I will turn the ship around. I don't think that that's sufficient, and I think that's misguided, because while we wait for this ship to turn around, we're 5 years into an economic crisis, I think, a political crisis, and Rome is burning.
Which brings us sort of smartly into looking at where South Africa is right now. Obviously, you mentioned Rome is burning. Boy, it is literally, I watched the program you did the other day where you evaluated all the presidents and you struggled to find anything positive to highlight from the sort of this current administration. And, on the back of that, one would imagine that they should get an absolute hiding at the polls this coming election season. But they're still going to be the biggest party. There's still people out there that are prepared to wait for this wonderful, what they call it, renewal program to play through. I've been hearing renewal now for 15 years. But do you think they're going to get a 50% plus one?
If the election were today, I don't think so. I have a process where I look at polls, but I look at the average of different polls. And from what I can glean right now, we're looking at somewhere between 43 and 47 for the ANC. I think it's within that band. I think that former President Zuma's announcement will dent the ANC further, and we haven't got any polls since then. I don't think it's going to be significant, but I think the ANC can't afford any more dents in any case. So I'm working on a scenario where they do come below 50. Of course, the jury's still out on exactly how far below 50 they come. And I think there are various scenarios that play themselves out if they're at 48 versus if they're at 43. But it's interesting that you do mention that. And I think we do need to spend time as a country really reflecting on why the ANC still does resonate, so far and wide. Part of the reason is that maybe they have been able to successfully misguide the population. But another part of the reason is that people do still believe in the ANC, whether one likes it or not. Another part of the reason is they have a sophisticated electoral machinery. And once that machinery gets going, the theater of the day, fades into the background, and people get lost in the election and the campaign, and the ANC is brilliant at campaigning. I often say if the ANC could govern like it campaigns, then we'd be living in a utopia. And so there are constraints. The other thing is, it's just two more things, if I can briefly. It's really difficult to create a political party. It's very, very hard. It's costly. And secondly, opposition parties haven't done enough to convince South Africans that, number one, change is necessary, but number two, if they were in power, they would be able to implement that change. And that's where we are.
It feels to me that a large swathe of South African voters can't really get their heads around being governed by somebody else. And we, obviously, those old enough to remember being governed by somebody else, that was not a pleasant experience. And it's now 30 years on. So, you've literally got a massive amount of people in the country who are unaccustomed to being governed by anybody but the ANC. And you start getting into the devil situation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's spot on. And I think we need to take that seriously. It's almost paradoxical to the extent that we're on this precipice. So if things really do get worse, then it would be terrible. And so people would prefer it to be bad, because in case it gets worse, that would be terrible. So in some ways, the bad situation is benefiting the ANC because it makes people more conservative to not want to try something else, because it could get so much worse. But Mike, I think you mentioned my family before, And one of the things that people actually don't know about me is that I'm actually probably more connected to the ANC than I am to the EFF. So, my father's wife is, a senior person within the ANC. My father obviously was in the ANC. My mother was a branch chairperson in the ANC. I know that whole social network, and I've been connected to it for a long time. And the thing about the ANC is it's a family.
Yes.
It's a family to people. So when you believe me, when you break from that family and you criticize the ANC and you say, I'm no longer supporting the ANC, you're not just making a political statement. You're breaking from your family. There are people with the ANC insignia on their tombstones. And it's a family also to the extent that people are there for you when, someone dies in your family. They'll come and support you. It's a family to the extent that you go on social occasions and you watch soccer together. So the ANC is so deeply woven into people's lives that they would prefer to stay within the family rather than break from their entire, social support system. And I think that's something we need to profoundly appreciate.
Yeah, it strikes me often that the ANC is almost a perfect hybrid between a football team supporter base and the Catholic Church, right? You've got the situation where you're not gonna change. If you're a Manchester United supporter, you're not going to say, "Okay, I'm now going to support Liverpool." You'll support them even if they get relegated. And on the other hand,
as I would support Liverpool even if they were relegated.
Careful what you wish for.
Speaking of debate,
and why I say the Catholic Church is that at the top end, right? The Catholic Church, when given the choice between doing the right thing and protecting children or looking after their fellow, higher ups in the church, they chose to protect people over children. So the ANC would rather, as Cyril himself said, he would rather go down as a bad president than as the guy who broke the ANC up.
Yeah, that's true. I think we also need to accept and appreciate that the ANC has made some important gains for people, especially people living in rural areas, people living in townships. Now, I've argued vociferously that many of those gains have been in turn eroded. So you've given people hope, and then even worse, you've now started to take it away. But people's lives have changed substantially since 1994, especially in the first 10 years of democracy. And I think people have a memory of what their lives were like before that, especially an older generation. That we can't dismiss. And for a long time, because I was so passionate about the wrong direction of the country, I refused to see that. But I think it is true that people feel, no matter how bad things are, that certain things that have changed in their lives are so important that they want to preserve them at all costs. And the ANC has done a good job in saying that if we leave, then all of those gains that matter so dearly to you could leave too.
Yeah. I hear what you say. I do have a bit of a problem with that line of thinking, only because a government isn't the body that did these things, right? They're there just merely to implement. My background and my sort of whole the way I view the world is that is just really the application of tax money. They're the custodians of it. It wasn't them. Right, that's what they were paid to do, as instructed by the Constitution, as directed by Parliament. It's not the ANC that built that highway. It's the taxpayers. Am I being, in your mind, too rose-tinted on this issue, or do you think there's going to come a time when South Africans are going to behave like that, to say, well, you're employed to give us water. So you gave us water. This is not an achievement. You just did what you were paid to do.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth to what you say, and there's a temptation to praise a fish for swimming. By the way, I think we should be much further developmentally than we are, and I think even in the first 10 years we didn't go far enough. I think we are yet to see a truly golden age in South Africa, and in fact, the amount of mediocrity and failure around us has prompted some to think that it's actually impossible to have water and electricity, and of course it's not. People have come to think it's impossible to have a dynamic economy for a 10-year period. It's not. South Africa could do it. I do think the ANC, or at least what I was alluding to is, I think the ANC has taken some policy decisions. I think people are rewarding the ANC actually rightly for dismantling a lot of legislative apartheid, for example. I think the creation of a social welfare system is a policy decision which matters to people and they want to preserve it. Should the government do that anyway? Yes. As far as basic services like roads and water, I mean, one can celebrate for 10 years, but I think 30 years in, we should have universal access to those amenities. Not only do we not have universal access, we have diminishing access, which should really puzzle and pain every South African.
Now, Sizwe, we've spoken about the ANC, and it does get a little bit tiresome because you don't want to go down that road where you start it's a very easy road to go down.
Yeah.
What do you make of the fact that they could be, especially over the last decade and a half, half of their reign has been so poor, but yet the opposition parties seem to be incapable of capitalizing on this obvious weakness of a party in decline, of a party beset by corruption, etc., etc. What do you put that down to, that the opposition, I mean, you mentioned tone deaf, it goes beyond that.
I agree.
What do you put this down to, that we are not getting any closer in the opposition, I'm talking about the opposition benches, aren't getting any closer to pressurizing, to putting literally electoral pressure on the ANC? What do you put it down to?
I put it down to this mysterious gap in the offering of the ever-growing number of opposition parties. And I believe we're going to have some sort of booklet of biblical proportions confronting us in the voting booth. And it's this. On the one hand, South Africa comes from a deeply divided, painful, traumatic past of racial and many other forms of injustice. And political parties need to understand that, appreciate that, and attempt to address it vigorously and urgently. On the other hand, we need a deeply capable, efficient public service and state that South Africans believe is capable of delivering not only basic services, but ultimately delivering an economy that gets on the trajectory to long-term high growth. We have options that can give us one of those things, but not the other. And what we need, in my view, and I welcome, if the ANC could do this, that would be great too. We'd all flock to the ANC. Yeah. We need political parties that can guarantee both of those things, that can say, if you trust us, we understand the history, we understand the past, and we will achieve justice for the country. But we are also going to be able to govern efficiently. We are also going to be good for the economy, and we are also going to be efficient and sustainable. And uniting those two imperatives seems to be the absent secret sauce of any South African political party. So you mentioned the DA. I think the DA has governed relatively well in the places that it's governed. I don't deny that, and I think it's silly to deny that. Of course, there is disparity in the way they govern and all the caveats, but they can fix some potholes there by the DA. I think the EFF is very good at resonating with people who understand the racial injustice in the country. But I don't think the DA can convince people they understand the racial injustice, and I don't think the EFF has succeeded in convincing people it could actually govern if it was given the power efficiently. And in between, we don't have a party yet that has proven it can do both those things at once.
Yeah, quite clearly, the DA's messaging is 100% where we govern better. Don't worry about these other issues. They're not going to pay the rent.
Yeah.
That doesn't resonate too well. The EFF's proposition, I'm struggling to understand. It seems to be just be permanently unhappy all the time. I've never quite understood a policy of permanent anger. Right, and whether it's constructive in any way, and to me, it's being played out in the polls. To tell people how shit your life is all the time, that's got to take its toll. That's not a vote catcher, if you ask me. Do you think there's any chance, or do you think while Julius Malema's in charge, that's just going to be the way they are? Just problems with everything all the time.
I would disagree with the characterization on one hand, but I think to the extent that the EFF marshals the anger that's in society, which no doubt it does, who else is speaking for the people who are angry? People who are hungry are really angry. People who are in poverty are really angry. People who feel they have not seen the fruits of this democracy 30 years in are really angry. And you've got the ANC telling them there's nothing to be angry about. And so the EFF provides in some ways an outlet, I think, for that anger. Now, does it do so constructively? Well, my take on the EFF for what it's actually worth is that when the EFF gets it right, they get it very right. And when they get it wrong, they get it very wrong. So when the EFF talks to black South Africans living in informal settlements and says, nothing has changed for you, they're the only party that's really saying it as those people feel. When the EFF comes and says, we're not going to celebrate the Springbok victory because, this is a symbol of apartheid, I think they got it really wrong on that occasion. And because they can be extreme in either resonating or failing to resonate, sometimes people can't trust, if they were to be given power, would they be really right or really wrong? And so I think the jury is still out for a lot of voters, even though they are growing, just as the jury's out on other opposition parties like the DA.
Yeah, I get the impression that, or let me rather phrase it like this. How angry do you think those South Africans are? Do you think they're angry?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think they're very angry. I think they're very, very angry. And I'm afraid I think they have reason to be angry.
Yeah, sure.
They have reason to be angry, number one, because of the historical legacy that's left them in that position out of their own making. People aren't in informal settlements, townships, and the outskirts of rural areas because they messed up in life. They're there because they were designed to be there.
Yeah.
And they haven't been able to extricate themselves from that in democracy. They're also there because the state has failed, despite promising them that their problems would be resolved in fairly short order, has failed to extricate them from that position. And so now we have a strange and a worrying combination of anger and hopelessness. So the question is, where does that get channeled? Does that get channeled to a chaotic rebellion? Does that get channeled through the anger of a political party? Or do we resolve the problems that are at the base of that anger? That's the choice that confronts South Africans.
I think there's one level worse than anger, and that is hopelessness. And it sort of seems to be pervasive, and I'm using quite a weird measure for that.
Yeah.
And that it seems to be that something that was a hallmark of the South African landscape being, riots, seems to have disappeared. It seems to be that, while Zuma was president, you had the country being really angry because they could see what was happening. Now, we did an event recently, and I said, everybody that says Ramaphosa is not leading, is not doing this, I think he's doing exactly what he intends. He's got us all walking at his slow pace. He's got business happy with no growth. He's got people living in dire circumstances, happy to live in those dire circumstances. He's got those people that used to burn tires on roads, and in some cases worse because they were so angry, doing nothing. While he goes out and the situation is perpetuated. I think that he's being quite masterful in the way that he's got the country to literally get into the sense of self-induced hopelessness. This is his shtick. This is what he does. He's not out there. There's diametrically different views. When Jacob Zuma was a president, there was a lot of energy around it. Some of it was negative, some of it was positive. It was all over the map. Now we're just all on Valium. That all comes out of the Ramaphosa way of doing things. We're all just going to sit back and don't question it. Don't do anything. I'll come back to you. And 6 months later, I won't come back to you. Nobody holds him accountable and so on. So I think that there's, in terms of development of the country, I think that hopelessness is a lot worse than anger, because anger you can channel. Anger, I saw anger in the late 80s turn into the new South Africa.
Sure, absolutely.
We've seen anger in some countries turn into dramatic political change. We've seen it most recently, I suppose, in Argentina, where the anger finally turned to a government that said, we're going to do things differently. Whether it works or not, that's a separate issue. But at least anger resulted in something. We are just not angry. There is just no outrage.
Look, there's a lot to what you say. I think President Ramaphosa has been masterful in anesthetizing the nation and in instituting a set of delay tactics that have caused us to assume that maybe not now, but in some distant day in the distant future, action will be taken. And that has lulled huge portions of the country into a false sense of security, out of which now slowly people are awakening 5 years later when it's far too late. I also think President Ramaphosa has been masterful in how he's gained control of the ANC. He had a choice. Would he be a one-term president who took the reins of the state and just took decisive decision and was probably ejected? Or would he slowly gain control of the ANC, taking maybe one term and then try to convert that into a second term where maybe some gains are made? He chose the second, and he's done it well. He's achieved his goals. As far as the anger, I suppose the one great exception would be the July 2021 unrest, which gave us a jolt of what could await if anger does boil over. But I agree with you. I think, largely speaking, there's been this climate of apathy that has gripped South Africa. And what I think the ANC, as the governing party, has done better than anything is convince us that there is no possible alternative universe which could be better than this.
Yeah.
Low growth is a natural product of the South African economy, and nobody, no matter how great, wise, brilliant they are, could take us to 5% growth. Water cannot be delivered because of some complex system of levers and pulleys that we are not aware of. And people believe that. People actually believe that life couldn't get better in South Africa. And that's the brilliance of the ANC's messaging over the last period.
Yeah, and if anybody's watching and they think we're only talking about poor people in poor areas falling for this, let's think of the role of business. In an economy that's not growing with 50% unemployment, they stepped in to help the ANC to prolong this agony. They should be out there fighting against this. So it's not just, before you think that this is just, what do you say, these blind ANC voters? It's not at all. It's people out there that should be outraged that are not. They're just happy to go along with it and do it even though it's against their own interests. There's some more water for you.
Oh, wow.
Right. So, which sort of brings us to...
Talk about service delivery.
Service delivery, yeah. We can deliver water better than the government can, one glass at a time. If we look at one of the outcomes of this has been that a whole lot of people, talented people, have said, you know what, there's only one thing that can solve this country, and that is if I run it. And now we've got a plethora of new parties. What do you think? Because it's almost unpredictable as to what could possibly happen with those parties. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, we've got, Action SA, Rise Mzansi, Bosa, this one, that one. We can carry on forever. We're going to run out of letters. But what do you think? Do you think they stand any chance of making a dent in any of this? Or who do you think they're going to hurt?
I think they do. And I think it's going to be a death by 1,000 cuts to get the ANC below 50. So what one would have expected is that there would be one credible alternative which would rise in all of this chaos to challenge the ANC, one or two. And what we've seen is that the DA is probably around the 20% mark. The EFF's probably just under that, although it'll be interesting to see how close those two are together in this election. And then there's just going to be this proliferation of increasingly smaller and smaller parties that have this power through our proportional representation system. It's going to be cacophonous. It's going to be unpredictable. I think Rise will get seats. I think Musi will probably just about squeak in, and some Bosa seats. Obviously Action SA will get in. The PA will probably get in as well. So we're going to have a lot more players, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have a lot more options. And ultimately, some form of consolidation has to happen, to this center left of the ANC as well, where we've got Maimane, we've got Rise, we've got Roger Jardine, we've got fragments of other political parties. And I mean, surely some form of consolidation has to happen there to give South Africans a credible alternative. But because it's so early and they all have just started, I think we're in very, very early times. And Parliament, I have a strange take on this. Parliament is going to be very frustrating, but it's going to be the first time that Parliament is actually what matters. So yes, it's going to be difficult to watch Parliament fighting and positions changing and governments being gridlocked at times. But at least it's the appropriate constitutional body. It's not just the back room of, the EFF or the ANC. Parliament is going to become a very important place to watch.
There's another place that's going to become very, very important. I feel that written into the Constitution, and I remember, you earn this hairstyle. I remember when the negotiations were taking place, and one of the big talking points was just how federal South Africa should be. There were obviously the outgoing white minority were quite keen on federalism.
Yeah,
the ANC could eye the entire prize, weren't too, and we got a largely federal system that, while the ANC dominated, didn't really show its real teeth, right?
Yeah.
And they were able to, for most of the time, at various times, govern all 9 provinces. And since the DA came along and took the Western Cape, they almost treated it as if it was another country, sort of an associate province. But now we are going to have provinces that are going to be governed by other parties / coalitions. That could become very interesting because there is a lot of independence for those provinces. Right now, those provinces don't want to exercise their independence because the mothership tells them what to do in the ANC. 8 of the 9 get told what to do. But it could look quite different. Certainly, the talk is 3 of those provinces ending up not in the hands of the ANC. Do you see that as a thing?
Well, I think that's a really interesting line of inquiry. And I think what we're going to see more generally is that our constitution envisages a more competitive electoral system. And so certain aspects of the constitution we have never been able to truly experience because the system has been so uncompetitive up to this point, and Parliament being one. I think there are many mechanisms within Parliament which make it a much more interesting place once you're not sure which way a vote is going to go. And similarly, with the division of national, provincial, and local power, when that starts getting divided up across many more different parties and one party is not in control of all of those spheres of government, then we suddenly are in a very interesting place because all kinds of bargains start entering into the picture. So just a few things to take note of. Obviously, the ANC is not going to govern the Western Cape. That much we know. Gauteng and KZN are all but gone as far as over 50%. Yeah. Even if we're just at that point, what that means is that the entire economic hub of South Africa in those 3 provinces is out of the control provincially of the ANC, outright at the very least. I would keep an eye on Free State as well, where things are tenuous. Things are very tenuous. You've got Ace Magashule meddling there as well, and it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Of course, the Western Cape is interesting for another reason, because the question is the extent to which the DA will retain its majority. One final thing that I think is interesting about this is the way that the provincial dynamics could spill over into the national dynamics. So if the DA and the ANC are going to unite, there's a possible deal where the DA says, look, we're under 50 in the Western Cape, give us back the Western Cape, and we'll help you get your majority nationally. And all parties are happy. There's a possibility that in KZN, the IFP could break from the multi-party charter and say, ANC, you give us the long-coveted KZN, and we'll help you get over the line nationally. So we'll certainly see that there'll be a very complex, system of arrangements across provinces, maybe even local governments and the national government, which will come into play after the election.
Yeah, because you're going to have to throw into that what's going on up here in the Gauteng metros, because that also comes. That's also going to be on the table.
Absolutely, and hardly an exemplar of stability outside of ANC government and with the ANC government. So maybe Gauteng is a bit of certainly Joburg, a warning.
Yes.
About what could happen too.
Now, recently, and I see that you've covered it in some detail. Did the ANC manage to get themselves a Hail Mary with their genocide case in the ICJ against Israel?
I think they did. I think this is going to play very well electorally for them. And I think you can see that they are latching onto this victory with all the might at their disposal. And it's a pity because, as I'm sure you've seen in my analysis, I think it was a good thing, and I think the legal team was brilliant. And I think this isolated move is probably the biggest victory of Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency. But what I'm starting to see is the ANC has figured out that they can now use this point to paper over various domestic failures. And I think that they're doing that to a great extent. I think that voters who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause were willing to vote for the DA because of the domestic challenges, but the ANC has given them something very, very hard to think about now. So as far as this plays politically, without delving into the merits of the case, but we can absolutely if you want to, I think this is going to be a possible act of rescue for the ANC. However, the election is a long way away, and there are many mistakes that can be made between now and then. So this case is the media scrutiny on this case is going to fade naturally. The case is going to ramble on for 5 years, but I do think that the ANC is going to benefit from this.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to agree with what you say there. Is that already in the aftermath of the decision, pretty soon the newspapers talking about the taps that don't run, or the load shedding is hard to get away from, etc. And one can be cynical in two fronts, and one is to say we can take the whole of the West to the ICJ, but you can't put crooked parliamentarians behind bars. Is that one part. And then, of course, the other part that I'm firmly in the camp, and I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but suddenly the ANC are able to solve all of their financial problems with their support of Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, as well as this court case. There is no doubt that they are being funded to do these things, and that you won't be able to keep a lid on for too long. So I think, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
That's an interesting point. I do think it's interesting that the ANC's financial woes seem to be resolving themselves. I mean, I don't think there's any evidence yet of exactly where that's coming from. So it would be speculative to suggest that it's, one knows the sources. But I think there's a deeper point, which is that it would be naive to imagine that the South African election is not of interest to a whole host of global actors. And I think South African elections always have been of interest to a whole host of global actors. And so the geopolitics of this election just got a whole lot more interesting because of South Africa's new centrality in the geopolitics of the Israeli-Palestinian question. And so I think we will see attempts to influence the election from a wide range of actors, both in the West and outside the West. And it will be interesting to see how this ICJ case actually impacts on the election, which is something to watch, how the two connect.
Well, Dr. Sizwe, Mpofu, Walsh, it's been an absolute pleasure discussing the South African political scene. You mentioned that magical word, the one that I'm obsessed about, which is geopolitics. I want to catch up on geopolitics in part 2.
Sounds
so
good.
If anyone who's enjoyed this, stick around. We are going to have part 2. But if you haven't seen SMWX online, Sizwe's channel, fantastic channel. He really does do some brilliant interviews, and I'm a big admirer of his work. And please head on out there. We'll leave links to the channel down below. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion with Dr. Sizwe and Mpofu Walsh. We'll see you in part 2, where we discuss geopolitics.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Michael.